Well, if you thought the last chapter was messy, this just gets even worse. We've seen the hatred amongst the brothers, the sons of Jacob, from different mothers, and his favouritism, and Judah has instigated the selling of Joseph into slavery, and then they've pretended that he's dead and his father is grieving, and that's where we left the story. At that time, all that's going on, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. Now, is it because of his guilt? Why does he move away? We don't know, but he's moving away from the land, again, never a good thing. Hanging out with the locals, never a good thing. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and made love to her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Wow, so it's all happening very quickly. Judah's gone to hang out with the locals, never a good thing. He's fallen in love with one of them, although the language in the original is kind of he saw her and took her, which sounds like Eve back in Genesis, and Esau too, and this is not good language, maybe more lust than love. He then has in quick succession 3 sons, and we speed on then very quickly to them growing up and getting a wife for the first son, but then him being so wicked that he's put to death. The word that's used there is the same as the description of the people before the flood, also the description of people before Sodom and Gomorrah is destroyed. And so whatever this son has done is pretty bad. Maybe not surprising, given his heritage amongst the Canaanites. Then Judah said to Onan, "Sleep with your brother's wife, and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law, to raise up offspring for your brother." Now this might seem incredibly weird for us as a culture, that you take the widow of the oldest brother and give her to the second brother and tell him to sleep with her. What on earth is going on here? Well, because of the inheritance and the family line going through the oldest son, it was vital that he had an heir. We can think about this in something like the story of King Henry VIII to bring some resonance to us as to the reality of the importance of this. So the widow is given to the second son, and he might have his own wife, but he will try and raise a son from this widow who will be the heir of the family plot. That's what's going on here, and it's a common thing amongst ancient peoples, and particularly amongst God's people of Israel. It's something that the Jewish leaders asked Jesus about a man who has a woman who's married to 7 brothers, and who will she be married to at the end. It's a common scenario for them, although it's so culturally weird to us. But Onan knew that the child would not be his, so whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to avoid providing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. So he takes the wife, the widow, and enjoys intimacy, sexual intimacy with her, but won't give her the child that is required. Deliberately ensures that doesn't happen, and does this a number of times, basically exploiting her for his own sexual gratification, and not carrying out his obligation. And so he's wicked too, and he's also put to death. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up, for he thought he may die too, just like his brothers." So Tamar went to live with her father's household. Judah, having lost 2 sons, is concerned he's going to lose his last, and so sends off the widow, saying, "When my youngest son is old enough, I'll give you to him." But he's got no intention of that at all. He doesn't want to lose his last son. This poor woman Tamar, married to an oldest boy who's so wicked he dies. She's got the grief of that. She's then played around with as a sexual toy, in effect, and dismissed again as he then dies. And now the father is lying to her, and she's stuck. She's contractually married into this family. She can't remarry elsewhere, but she's just going to be left. She's a victim here in all of this. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira the Adullamite went with him. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then went down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. So Judah is mourning his wife. He goes out with the men to celebrate the harvest, and this is often when, in pagan terms, there will be sexual immorality, as they would sleep with the prostitutes and celebrate and get drunk, and he's heading down into that environment. And Tamar, hearing of the news and aware of this, goes and disguises herself. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked. He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" "Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand," she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road in Enaim?" "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here," they said. So he went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said that there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here." Then Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we'll become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result she's now pregnant." Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned to death." Now this is just horrible, isn't it? The complete hypocrisy. This is one of God's people living amongst the pagans, who ought to be giving a good example, and yet, having slept with a shrine prostitute and paid for sex, he's got no embarrassment about the fact that when he hears that this daughter-in-law, who he's not intending to give to his son anyway, is now pregnant, that she should be put to death. I mean, it's just horrific hypocrisy. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said, and she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Jacob recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah," and he did not sleep with her again. Boom, he's caught out. And that's quite a declaration, isn't it? She's more righteous than I. He recognizes his wrongdoing in this, and that she's behaved honourably. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, so the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, "So this is how you've broken out." And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was named Zerah. Just before we carry on in the reading, and I think the two chapters are put together for contrast sake, at the end of this messy situation, Tamar has two boys. She's got twins. One of them, his hand comes out and a thread is put on to mark that he's the firstborn, but then the hand goes back in and a second brother comes out before him. A younger comes out before the older, and his name is Breaking Out. And now we're heading to the story of Joseph, the youngest brother in the family, barring Benjamin, who is imprisoned, who the older brothers are trying to suppress and get out of the way and remove, and yet the family line story, as so often happened down through the generations already, is that the younger brother is the chosen one rather than the older, and so they can't do that. Now, that's all fascinating, but there's also another twist. It's actually through Judah and his family line that the promised Messiah is going to come, and Tamar has rescued that family line by her being honourable, and the only grandchild born to Judah is through Tamar, and Tamar then is mentioned in the family line of Jesus. Now, it's hard to get your head around. It's just so screwy and messy, and yet God is at work through this to preserve, and the supposedly godly line living amongst the pagans are ungodly, and yet one of the pagans is godly in preserving this line, and it seems so messy, and yet God is at work. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. It's the first mention of the Lord in a number of chapters now. And in all of this mess that's going on, we find that the Lord is with Joseph. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favour in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. For the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. So despite all the rubbish that's happened to Joseph, and having gone from being the favoured son, probably not doing a lot of work now, to being a slave, the Lord is with him, and everything he does is blessed, and Potiphar recognises that in Joseph. We're not told that Joseph is aware of this, but under Joseph's hand, blessing comes to Potiphar's house, and so he's given more and more responsibility, and Potiphar abdicates all that responsibility to Joseph. Happy for him to deal with all the business, because it's all working. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Now, this is interesting as well, isn't it? Joseph, who seemed to be very ungodly in his attitudes with the dreams and being the favourite son, although we weren't entirely sure, at this point, unlike his brother Judah, who's behaving abominably with the Canaanite women, Joseph recognises that to sleep with Potiphar's wife would be a wicked thing, but most importantly a sin against God. He's not going to live in such an unrighteous way. And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her, or even to beat with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he'd left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." All lies. As Joseph is trying to do the honourable thing, he is having the opposite pinned on him. And this is just so unfair and so unjust. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favour in the eyes of the prison warder. So the warder put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warder paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. So lies are pinned on Joseph. He's unfairly accused, and it's upheld, and he's put in prison. And yet we're told that the Lord is still with him in prison, and that yet again he's rising to a position of influence, because everything he does, the Lord grants him success in. Two such strange stories side by side: Judah's immorality, Joseph's honesty. In the midst of Judah's immorality, a pagan daughter-in-law does the honourable thing to preserve the family line, which is going to lead to Jesus. Joseph, treated tragically unfairly by the pagans around him, and ends up in prison, and yet the Lord is with him. I think the older I get and the more I read these stories, the more bizarre they are and the more weird they are, and you put yourselves in the shoes of anyone or the sandals of anyone in these stories, and we know the end. This is always the problem. If you look at them in the midst of the troubles, what a mess, what a horrendous mess. And yet the Lord is at work and the Lord is present. And actually that does bring us great reassurance as we find ourselves in all sorts of predicaments and complicated situations. Family can be so messy and so broken and so difficult, and the people you expect good things of can behave in such an ungodly way. People you don't expect anything of can behave in surprisingly righteous ways. And yet, even in the darkest places, the Lord is present with his people, present to bless, present to preserve the family line, present to work, to bring salvation. And we can be encouraged in that even today, no matter how complicated and messy your family situation is. Read these stories, take comfort in them, working through to where it's going to lead us in the next few days.